Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 1161. People are flooding. A few minutes earlier, the quiet sound of fists clenching and teeth grinding could be heard across the southern wall of Delta. The men standing here, looking in helpless fury as their home was destroyed, were the last remaining soldiers of Krna, who were left to guard the city wall until Spacia arrived. Maybe it was wrong to call them the last remaining soldiers of Krna, as all of them were locally from Delta and had joined Krna's army to protect their homes. They had volunteered for this last task, not because they wanted more time to give their home a last goodbye. Looking at his men from his office inside the gatehouse, Commander Garoun sighed. Looking at the stack of documents on his desk, he was seriously deliberating their next steps. His fingers thoughtfully brushed over the stack of employment contracts. Yes, his men had not stayed to hand over their home to the tyrants of Spacia. Their plan was actually to use the remaining days to annul the magic contracts that bound them to the orders of Merkrautsar and defend Delta against the invaders. He himself had wrestled with the doubts in his mind for a long time. He was born and raised in Krna and had always been proud of his loyalty to the Empire, but he couldn't agree to the things happening here. Ultimately, he had decided to help them, instead of stopping them. There was no concrete information about how long Spacia would have taken to arrive in Delta, but they thought to have at least a couple days to correctly annul the magic contracts and set them free from their oath of loyalty. Maybe even have enough time to organize a defense force. Yet, man proposes, God disposes. The supervision had barely left this world, when the demon army flooded the city, and they all were damned to watch on helplessly because of these contracts. Their orders bound them to the tops of these walls. The consequences of breaking the orders would have rendered them just as useless as staying on the walls. They would just increase the number of casualties. A couple of days to break the contracts correctly. What if he just burned them right here, right now? They would all suffer a terrifying recoil, he might even die, but his men would survive. Momentarily weakened, sure, but free to take action and defend their people. But many of them would die, throwing themselves into the flood of bodies they couldn't stop, not even in their top form. Conflicted, he kept staring at the contracts, pressured by the curses of his men on the wall and the noises of destruction of the city. Screams of agony and fear, explosions and desperate battles, the sound weighed heavy on his mind. To condemn his men to face a pointless death, for the vain satisfaction of allowing them to die in glory, defending what they loved? Or keep them on the walls, probably preserving more people of Delta than they could save in the battle below? His fist slammed on the table. He couldn't make the decision. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't stand by either of the options. Cowardly, he rather didn't make a decision at all. He couldn't face the possible consequences, Woohoo woohoo! In his weakest moment, he suddenly heard horns shaking the district, even the walls below his feet. Running outside, he joined the commotion on the walls. People are flooding into Delta. It's a massive army, the lookout at the watchtower cried out, not bothering to use skills or magic to report the scene. Thunder and lightning suddenly raged in the skies above them. Garoun could now also see the knights suddenly pouring into the city from a place west of the southern gate. They couldn't see where exactly all of these people came from, but he recognized some of the armors, before. Here yet. Minas Mar had come to claim Delta. Present. The demon commander's face fell seeing his troops being pushed back like this. However, this wasn't the first time, and it would not be the last time he experienced a difficult situation on the battlefield. He quickly judged the situation and the causes. Although Minas Mar had the upper hand when it came to the quality of foot soldiers, this could be made up with numbers. What truly guided the tide of battle were the groups of high-profile leaders slaughtering demons and pushing back the front line. Apart from Minas Mar, there were also a few groups of fighters that had emerged from among the populace of Delta, that were resisting. One in particular was pushing back with equal power to the soldiers of Minas March. If they wanted to use their numerical advantage, they had to balance the influence of these elites. Decisively, he called out for his troop of loyal subordinates. They were demons he had handpicked and trained. It would be easy for them to get rid of most obstacles. Once the elites were gone or occupied, they could use their numbers to take care of the golems and guards. Lachmal, Krishmal, Sturbmal, go up there and stop those beasts. Don't look at me like that, I just want you to distract them, not slay them, he spoke to the 3 demon generals under his direct command, who had the best skills in aerial combat. Winemal, Hormal, Cainmal, he named another 10 of his subordinates. Take some people and stop those leading the front lines, he continued, pointing at a few places. Among them were an anthropomorphic bull and his team, quickly dispatching demons with wide AoE skills, a team of knights leading golems with terrifying efficiency, and various more parties of oath guards led by significantly strong players identified as members of Mina's March. But before they could go to the places instructed by their commander, 9 of them were struck down with a single attack each. 2 had arrows blowing up their heads. Another 2 were killed by the same attack, something that looked like an orange stake made of solid heat and fire. Their bodies instantly turned to ashes. The 5th died from a lightning bolt and the 6th had his heart skewered by an aura spear. Number 7 was killed by a bone stake. 8 got bisected by a wind blade. The last one was probably the most terrifying one, since he suddenly started screeching in fear and simply died without any signs of how. "Yo, big guy, did you think we would just leave you alone?" a caster with a dainty wand, wearing silver plate armor asked him joyfully. The surrounding building roofs were filled with figures, some of which had just killed his personal subordinates with ease. The fat demon squinted. He couldn't remember their names, but he recognized their faces from the dossier he had read about Mina's March. All of them were part of the teams, the guild used as external strike forces, innocently dubbed the field teams. "Yes sir," the remaining 4 underlings asked unsurely. They didn't know whether they should defend the commander or use his earlier command as an excuse to run. These maggots wouldn't be any help anyway. "Just fuck off and do what you are told, I can take care of them myself," the commander said grimly. If they could distract the beasts in the sky, they could at least gain the advantage in the sky. It was obvious, what would happen to the battlefield, if these people were allowed to roam freely. He on the other hand would face off against the elites of Minas Mar alone and keep them here. He had some pride in his strength. He was no weaker than the sneaky pig that had an unlucky encounter with the unleashed Amazon. The Amazon wasn't here, but he didn't dare underestimate his opponents. Unlike this pig, he was ready to do anything to survive. Chapter 1162 Upper Ranks of a Different Faction. There were no golems to broadcast this battle. Nobody wanted Krina to hurry back, or Spacia to hurry up. While the group that had left Earth to level up took care of the upper ranks of the demons, Seth was left to deal with the upper ranks of a different faction. "I would not have thought that you would be the one to open the door for me," Seth greeted their informant with a wry smile. Standing at the door of the Parliament building was Rich, the slave mancer. Behind him stood a platoon of people in the High Leave 90, clad in epic and relic-rated items. "You know, you can't choose your family, but you can choose your employer," he said and shrugged, keeping his wry smile. Rich had actually contacted Minas Mar after the news of Krina's evacuation became known and asked to join as an affiliate. It was his information that allowed Minas Mar to arrive in time to stop the demons from harming their future asset. He didn't just offer information, but also the Parliament. Seth didn't need to be an experienced politician to know that these old fogies would not let go of their power easily, despite having done an awful job so far. After the hero left, Rich actually became the strongest player they could hire for money in Delta, and they gave him command over the elites, they had painstakingly nurtured with the tax money of Delta. Now their very own private army held the door open for the new owner of the place. Minas Mar guaranteed tree stations the right to govern themselves, but there was no way they could just leave the leadership of Delta as it was. Once the demons were dealt with, a thorough clean-up was in order. Without warning, the blacksmith kicked open the room to the Parliament. There had been some changes in the past months with Merkrautsar's intervention. At the center of the wide auditorium was a bench where the council sat like a panel of judges, while the rest of the politicians were seated on their normal seats. Originally, the Parliament was supposed to be an assembly of elected representatives, each with the same standing. Here it was restructured to look like the elected representatives had to speak to and be judged by the council, which had the power to make and change the final decision. All eyes turned to the door in shock. They were in the middle of evacuating the auditorium when the door suddenly flew straight across the room. Ichabod, standing by the bench, quivered in anger at the sight of the Tower Master strolling into the auditorium. "You have some gall to just break in here. Do you know where this is?" he screeched, huffing and puffing like a steam engine. "What's wrong with walking around my property? I'm sure you heard my announcement earlier. Minas Mar will be taking charge of Delta from now on," Seth said smugly, with a calm and confident voice. They were not here to talk. The decision had already been made. He was simply informing them. "How did you get in here?" Ichabod barked, ignoring his words. The older gentleman at the center of the council cleared his throat to get the attention. All of us here are elected representatives of the people. By what right do you think you can relieve us of our duty? He asked, trying to sound calm, but it was clear that he was frightened. By my power as the new landlord. Don't worry, not all of you will lose your job, it would be a little hard to find substitutes right away. Once we sifted out the spies and sympathizers of Spacia and Krina, I'm sure some of you can be reinstated until we hold a new election here, he answered graciously. The bard's words were clear. The old man realized that there was no negotiating with Seth. He looked around, but the tower master had come without familiar faces like Mary or Lena, who could be talked to diplomatically. Please don't resist as the oath guard takes you into custody until the situation has calmed down a little, the bard asked nicely, as the team of armored guards entered the room. What happened to the people we sent to guard the entrance? The old man asked Seth, as one of the oath guards put them in arcane shackles. Oh, we let them in, Rich offered an answer, popping up from behind the oath guards in the cracked door frame. Rich! You betrayed us! Ichabod exclaimed in an ear-piercingly high voice. The short, rotund man was ready to jump at the slavemancer's throat if it wasn't for two oath guards holding him down. Yeah, I worked for you for over a year and had enough time to make up my opinion. Delta is better off if Minas Mar takes charge, compared to you bunch of opportunistic hyenas, Rich said with a frown, his eyes wandering over the group of assemblymen in disgust. It was clear that there were no good people among them, in his opinion. What will you do with us? The older man asked him. For now, we will put you under house arrest in the Parliament building. Your final fate will be decided after the investigations. But don't worry, none of you will die, Seth said with a friendly smile, but somehow the politicians could help their minds circle around how many terrible things weren't actually lethal. Tui, the obese demon commander spat out saliva mixed with purple blood. He was bleeding from several wounds across his massive body. Other parts were bruised or burned. He had already unleashed his full power, rising to leave 180, but he could not keep up with the elites of Minas March. It wasn't even that they had good team play, the number one reason for high-ranking beings to fall at the hands of weaker players. Each and every one of them possessed terrifying skills in attacks, despite being over 40 levels lower than him. Yet, it wasn't them he was afraid of. What struck horror into him was that monstrous tower master. He had realized the problem some time ago. Each and every one of his opponents had not just a high level but was also covered in relics and legendary items. That blacksmith had created monsters, without anyone realizing. For some reason, the demon even thought that this was just the tip of the iceberg. His eyes wandered over the circle of terrifyingly overgeared existences. Despite the hard fight, neither of them showed signs of wounds or exhaustion. While he had suffered, he had not even put a dent into them. This was a pointless fight. The commander had already made the decision, the moment he recognized their power. He had to flee. It was his only chance of survival. Of course, WebNovel hated cowards, but he also liked people who brought results. Maybe he couldn't beat Minas Mar here, but bringing back the information he gained here would be worth his life, maybe more. Haha, I see that I can't beat you, so I will take you down with me, he hollered boisterously. Concentrating all of his energy in his shell of muscle and fat, he started to glow in a vicious light. As expected, the champions backed off expecting he prepared for a suicide attack. On the contrary, this was actually his ultimate escape skill. As 90% of his body and energy turned into a terrifying bomb, carpeting part of the city, the demon commander's true body shot through the sky with incredible speed. He was moving toward the summoning circle. It wouldn't take much to configure it and return to. His thoughts stopped, his body stopped, and his eyes fell on a scene out of his nightmares. The giant summoning circle was destroyed. The thick lines of metal, glowing in a demonic red, were severed and had lost their luster. Golems, the size of cows and the shape of murderous termites were busy taking it apart, harvesting the materials, and vanishing in holes in the ground. Oh my, did you really think you could escape? A lascivious voice spoke to him. Throwing his head around, he found a curvaceous lady standing in the air, looking at him with sarcastic pity. We already made sure that nobody will get out of here. Really? Nobody, she added with an ominous smile, that had the demon's heart throb in fear. Nobody but these two were there to see what happened, but the commander vanished from the world, without as much as a scream. Chapter 1163 Outrageous Defense. Valiantly, Tekker jumped to the front of the party, blocking the Fat Demon's explosion attack from the field team members of Mina's march. Although he was behind in level, he still had the most outrageous defense in all of Mina's Mar, apart from their tower master. The team members were lucky enough to hide behind Tekker. Despite being momentarily blinded by the bright light, Tekker managed to deploy the Blessings Elixiaries and Onyxitos to protect the city below. The explosion that could have eradicated a quarter of the district crashed into his blessed shield and was redirected upwards. Still, the blessing was not almighty. Tekker was only able to mitigate the damage to the city directly below. The explosion still flattened the buildings in a radius of 100 meters and damaged many further away. A quarter of the district lost their windows, but not their lives. When the light finally let off, they looked at the destruction below in trepidation. Nobody really expected Delta to become a battlefield today. There were still people in the area. Of course, collateral damage was the norm in a war, but all of them had hoped to take over Delta as peacefully and with as little damage as possible. The worst resistance they had expected were the subordinates of Krna that still manned the city gates and the council shaped by the Peddler of Ruin. That they would face a horde of demons wasn't planned. Movement in the ruins caught their attention as more and more rebels started being pushed aside. Demons and people emerged from the ruins of the buildings. For a moment, they had forgotten that players were much more resilient than people before the apocalypse. There was still a chance to rescue people even in the epicenter of the damage. Monique growled when she saw the demons that managed to crawl from the debris attack the people who had just managed to survive a catastrophe. She didn't have to say anything, as the people around her already rushed to the ground, ending the demons. The Chosen of Athena stayed up on the roof and looked at the situation. Athena was a goddess of warfare and strategy, this was why Monique was given the command in the field. Looking at the change in the situation, she frowned. The demon army's commander and their elite leaders were gone, but their burning desire couldn't be quenched by the sudden loss of leadership. On the contrary, without a guiding hand, they turned even wilder and more dangerous, spreading out to hunt the survivors still present in Delta. Monique clicked her tongue, there were simply too many small fries running around. The urban battlefield rendered large-scale skills that could end them all useless, unless they wanted to wipe out the remaining people in Delta, too. Lifting her hand, she shot a signal flare to the sky. Despite being right below the city, the Tower of Minas Mar had never interfered with Delta, except during a crisis. A big reason for this was the security systems of Krna, which wouldn't have allowed any interference without the existence of the tower becoming known. It was time to reveal a fraction of what it could do. Shortly after the signal was given, the noise of battle fell silent. All demons in range suddenly became sluggish, weaker ones outright falling asleep. The magic remote cast by the tower ego had its limits as remote casting was a terribly inefficient technique, however, demons across half of Delta had instantly become less dangerous or were completely neutralized. Originally, they made up this strategy to deal with the remnants of Krna's army if they decided to abandon the city walls and attack. It could also be turned into an offensive attack if Spacia managed to invade the city area of Delta. After all, the enemy empire's troops were already preparing to come to Delta. Of course, the danger wasn't over with this. Just because they were sleeping or drowsy for now, didn't mean they weren't dangerous. After the sleep magic was cast, teams of golems appeared in the streets, teleported by the tower. They were the ordinary merchandise, originally meant to be sold to Arjit Noer. They now flooded the streets of Delta. Although they couldn't compare to the golem knights Seth Yuld, they were enough to deal with the weakened demons. To allow for flexible decision-making, each team of merchandise was led by one of Seth's golem knights with a budding ego or a named golem. She didn't dare use the strategy Sleepyhead before, because of the demon elites possibly negating the magic or using large-scale attacks to destroy the golems. Unlike them, the demons would have any qualms about destroying the city and killing many, to get rid of the enemy. With the massive influx on their side and the already incurred losses for the demons, the numbers on the ground were now even, not counting Delta's civilians and adventurers not leaving without a fight. Some were another problem, for both sides. Nobody liked demons, but it didn't mean they were okay with Minas Mar's objective either. Those attacking or resisting in the middle of the chaotic battlefield were taken care of by the Oath Guard, one way or the other. Luckily, people hostile toward Minas Mar were few and far between. Despite smear campaigns against them in the past, Minas Mar's reputation had improved lately and became much better than the public opinions toward Krna, or an invading demon army. Public opinion of either was horrible, the latter being slightly worse. Their performance during the tournament incident had not just revealed that legends existed on Earth and could enter Earth, but also that Minas Mar was a force to be reckoned with, as they had actually managed to defeat said legend. Across the whole of the Pathworks and the System worlds, it might not have been as big a deal, but on Earth, they were proven to be the strongest. In chaotic times, people wanted strong leaders they could rely on and who could protect them, and Minas Mar spared no expense to propagate this image to the people of Delta, ever since they decided to take over. As such, the reaction to Minas Mar's arrival was no surprise. "Thank you so much," the Oath Guards were praised with cheer and gratitude by the people they saved from demons or pulled from the wreckage to evacuate to the safety of Minas Mar's shield. With the implementation of the strategy Sleepyhead, the situation quickly turned for the better and the troops of Minas Mar were able to sort out the mess. When Seth returned to the embassy after capturing the politicians and grounding them in the parliament, they were mostly busy with cleanup instead of fighting. There were only individual pockets of demons left, spread across the city outside their influence. Those were still heavily besieged by local powers and golems. "Seth, there is someone who would like to meet you," Evie approached Seth when he returned. The Chosen of Persephone had taken part in the battle until the demon commander self-detonated, but had not summoned any of her undead. They didn't want to scare the people of Delta. Instead, she had started helping with organizing the refugee camps and medical tents. Behind her was a woman with a crooked smile and a smoldering cigar in the edge of her mouth. She wore a silver suit and a red coat with black fur was draped around her shoulders. Everything about her screamed shady underworld boss. However, Seth actually recognized her. It wasn't just because he was able to feel their connection, but the aura of this woman was hard to forget. She was like a forged edge. Despite her appearance, she was straight and sharp, hard, but flexible enough. "They are from the Riot Guild here in Delta. They joined our troops earlier on in the fight and have proven quite useful in battle," Evie explained, but the blacksmith didn't actually need the introduction. "I remember you," he said before she could introduce herself. She was one of the 400 Faer he created from the ego souls of Tanamol's soul tank. To be precise, she was one of the 200, who decided to leave, instead of staying with Minas March. "Boudica, right?" Seth asked. Him remembering her name shocked her so much, that she even lost her smile, staring at him. "Why yes. We have come to follow the oath," she said when she found her tongue again and kneeled before him. In the back, the group of misfits, half of which were also Faer, followed her in the action. Evie was left looking confused at what was happening here. The oath was for the Faer that had left, to come to their aid in case of emergency. Seth never really expected any of the leavers to keep the oath, but it was a nice surprise. "Then I will welcome you back with open arms. Follow Evie and see where you can help here." Chapter 1164 Commander Garaun. A few hours later. "So, what about the troops from Krina?" Seth asked in the round. The leaders of Minas Mar had gathered in the occupied parliament to talk about the current state of Delta. The demon commander was slain, and the demon army had been mostly eradicated by the golems. The survivors of Delta had been evacuated under the barrier of Minas Mar for now, as even the portal defense had been shut off by Krina before leaving. It was clear that there was more going on than a peaceful retreat, but it was important to pacify Delta first. While there were still some demons on the loose, the last imminent threat was the troops of Krina that were left to man the walls of Delta to protect the city against monsters and the undead. They could only truly stabilize their hold on Delta, once they were dealt with. Their commander said he would only talk to the Tower Master and Princess Lena. Monique answered his question. So far, the guard on the walls had made no move to either attack or surrender. Seth nodded, pondering. "I see. Lena, what do you think?" he asked the Princess of Krina. This condition could end up as either a trap or a negotiation. Lena used to be the representative of the Empire in Delta. Although she had lost her connections to her allies in the capital, maybe there were still allies or sympathizers of hers among the people stationed here. "I can't tell, but I'm willing to go meet them," she answered, determined to take the risk. After all, Krina was still her home. Seth could understand if she didn't wish to see the blood of her countrymen spilled by her new friends. "Then let's go. There is no reason to waste any more time. The sooner they are dealt with, the sooner we can back to important things," the blacksmith decided. Spacious troops were on their way to take over for Krina. Until the time they arrived in Delta, there were a few things Seth wanted to finish. Effect-seeking, Seth and Lena rode Puffles across the city to the southern main gate, where the headquarters of Krina's garrisons in Delta was located. The Ivisor had grown a lot doing whatever it liked, traveling around with Tatzel in the northern wilds. The nightmare centipede in his maximum size was now almost 200 meters long and the thickness of 2 trains. The head was so big, that the two were able to comfortably stand on the Eye-Visor's golden neck shield as puffles flew through the skies over the city. To use the great me for showing off, the Eye-Visor complained. Can you blame me? Although you didn't get the chance to show up during the tournament, the world should know your greatness. You should land right before the interior side of the gate, to really showcase your splendor. Seth buttered him up. Hat, calling him a show-off? The sudden wiggle of the long body behind them showed who the vain one was. As the blacksmith suggested, the massive centipede impressively landed at the interior side of the southern main gate. The plaza there was just big enough for the Eye-Visor to roll up 3/4 of its body, while the rest stood erect, lowering his head for Lena and Seth to stand eye to eye with the guards on the wall. Also, the perfect height to blast the whole structure to nirvana with a solar beam. The bard's eyes wandered over the faces of the soldiers, lined up on the wall. He could see them swallow so hard, he imagined hearing it. Atop the gatehouse of the main gate, he found a man, wearing a more elaborate and high-quality armor than the rest of the gathered. I'm Commander Garoun of Krina's 1234th Legion, I greet the princess and the tower master, he exclaimed the moment Puffles finally reached his stable position. Seth had never seen him, but Commander Garoun was a name he had known ever since they set up shop in Delta. He was a man who had command over Delta's walls ever since they were raised. I'm glad to see a familiar face here, Lena said with a wry smile. Despite the change in representatives, the leader of the city wall had never changed. He was someone she knew from her time on duty. However, this also meant that he never had a deep connection with any of them. Garoun was a pure military man, without interest in politics outside of his duties. Hello, Commander. Are we talking out here, or are we going somewhere more comfortable? Seth asked nonchalantly. It won't be a long conversation, and I hoped for my subordinates to hear it, too, the commander admitted, explaining his inhospitality of not inviting them in for a cup of tea. I hoped we could make a deal here. A deal? Lena whispered, surprised. As mentioned, Garoun was a stoic man of duty. A man who would stick to the rules and his orders, no matter what. Suggesting a deal didn't seem like something he would do. Yes. The men still stationed on these walls, are locals that did not want to leave their home until the last moment. Princess, you have the power to relieve them from their oath of alliance and allow them to defect and join Minasmar in their defense of Delta, he revealed his shocking request. Not as shocking to Seth, but Lena was flabbergasted, as it went against anything she knew of the man. Since her face asked the question, without the need to utter a word, Garoun continued speaking. Merkrautsar and his master have sold out Delta to Spacia, he stated, his fist clenched so hard, that his knuckles whitened. Not only that, he used the ambassador's token to give binding orders to stay on and defend the walls until Spacia arrived. We were forced to watch the demon army, unable to enter the city and help the citizens, he continued with a grim tone. The faces of the soldiers beside him were full of anger and frustration, but not aimed at them. The commander faced Seth directly. His clear blue eyes showed a will of steel and determination, showing that his next words came from his heart with sincerity. Thank you for stopping the demons. Following his words, the soldiers behind him nodded and repeated his thanks in their own words, whether spoken out or mumbling it, all the soldiers showed their gratitude in some way. The blacksmith had come to conquer their homes, and they actually thanked him for it. That was the state of Delta had reached. The bard pondered. There was no reason to refuse additional help, but could they really be trusted? There was no guarantee that there wasn't some spy among them. On the other hand, they had ways to make sure that even a spy couldn't dance out of line. Lena, what do you think? Could you do what he said? He asked the princess. If she couldn't relieve them of the power of the oath to the Empire, there was no reason to speak any further anyway. The princess had recovered from the shock she suffered due to Garoun's request and nodded hesitatingly. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to take them in as a subsidiary force in Delta, Lena finally answered, already taking into account the incorporation of Delta into Minasmar's system. Although Minasmar allowed the tree stations autonomy, they also had affiliated forces and guilds in the various cities to help with security, maintenance, and the protection of the guild's own interests, concerning dungeon materials and mining operations. Taking the remaining soldiers of Krina and turning them into a subsidiary guild, was also along the lines of Seth's thoughts to make sure they didn't betray them. Subsidiaries gained benefits and part of the profits. In exchange they not only had to listen to orders from Minasmar, but they all signed magic non-disclosure agreements. though Seth considered using soul contracts in this case, just to make extra sure. What do you need to release their oaths? The blacksmith asked. He doubted it was enough to be of royal blood and say that they were fired. However, his question wasn't answered by the princess but by the commander. Their employment contracts, Geraun said, waving a thick stack of papers. Merkrautsar actually left them here. Lena exclaimed, shocked at the uncharacteristic negligence of the peddler of ruin. At this point, there were too many coincidences. Lena seemed to have come to the same conclusion as the blacksmith, the whole scenario was planned. But if they planned to bind the guards to the walls and let the demons raise Delta, how could they forget He didn't leave them. I smuggled them out during the commotion when they were getting everything ready to leave, the commander admitted honestly. Then Seth realized it. You also wanted to take over Delta, he exclaimed with a laugh. Not fully. The original plan was ripping the contracts and facing Spacia with everything we had, bearing the side effects of destroying the contract, the commander explained. The soldiers beside him nodded. It really seemed like they were determined to fight Spacia to the last man, despite the risk of facing a legend. That the demons appeared right as they were left behind, was probably a shock for them, too. But with Princess Lena here, that won't be necessary. She can simply annul the contracts, and set them free, Geraun added. I still don't get why you are going so far. You know that this is technically treason, right? Didn't you always loyally serve the Empire? Did you think of the implication it would have if a remnant force of Krna broke the agreement with Spacia and started a skirmish? The princess couldn't help herself and asked the question that had occupied her mind for a while. I may be loyal, but I'm not blind, princess. Even when I followed orders that were hard to execute, I always knew that they were made out of trying to get the best possible outcome for everyone. But this decision is just a manufactured excuse for personal gain. I couldn't just blindly follow these orders, even if it meant creating another war front. Seeing the situation in the city, I only feel confirmed in my decision. Wow, that really sold it. You are in. Seth commented, completely breaking the atmosphere. Unfortunately, I can't, Geraun blocked his offer right from the start. Why not? The blacksmith asked surprised. Geraun really seemed to care for his people and the situation. My contract was not here in the first place, but if I defected here, Merkrautsar and his master would be able to use this as an excuse to intervene again. It would be best for me to be officially captured in a mutiny. You can then send me back to Krna, with that message of your independence, the commander explained realistically. He is right, Lena agreed with him, though her expression didn't suggest that she liked or totally agreed with that action. Well, we can talk about that when it really comes to it. I doubt we will get to release or communicate with Krna before we deal with Spacia, Seth said with a shrug of his shoulders. Whether they would really send the commander back a messenger or not, would depend on whether they managed to properly make an example of the forces of Spacia. Maybe they won't even dare to ask for you to be sent back. Chapter 1165. Maybe not even one. Originally, their representative Nadina and her troops were supposed to enter Delta through the system church next week. After their arrival, we were supposed to return to Krna and leave the branch to Spacia's priests. Simon explained how Spacia was meant to arrive if everything went as planned. Seth, Lena, Mary, Commander Geraun, some others and Simon sat together at a table in the system church of Delta, to make a rough outline of the current situation and their plans from now on. Their biggest problem was that they didn't know how much longer they had before the troops of Spacia arrived. Simon's information revealed that they had at least 5 days until they would try to enter through the system church. Considering the demon attack, they guessed that they planned to wait for the demons to wipe out Delta and the remaining soldiers, before using the church's teleport formation to officially enter Earth and heroically strike back the demonic forces. At least this plan was thwarted with the entrance of Minas Mar and their takeover of Delta. We should occupy the system church in Delta and block cross-world travel until people from the Order of Minas Mar have completely taken over operations here, Mary suggested the obvious next step. Over the past months, and with Simon's help, Minas Mar had reared their own branch of the system church in Minas Mar, made up of Erdhan priests and personnel. Like the Adventurers Guild, the church's only official affiliation was with their god. But obviously, they were not really removed from the secular world, and every greater power had their own orders or branches of the church, more loyal to them and their ideals. Everyone nodded at Mary's suggestion. With the teleport portal at the center of Delta blocked, Spacia would have to enter Earth somewhere else and travel to Delta. Nobody on the table suggested using this to set a trap. Letting the enemy in and fighting them in the middle of the city, was almost guaranteed to lose them the city, even if they won the battle. How long do you think they will need to come to Delta when they realize that the teleport is blocked? Mary asked in the round. Although some of them had experience with Spacia, especially Garoun as a military expert, they couldn't guess how much longer they would have. Unfortunately, we have no information about the location of Spacia's entry point to Earth. There could also be more than one. Lena shared her worries. The best guess would be that they have at least one close to Y City since they approached that district first. We also don't know how fast they travel, Garoun added, enforcing the point that they pretty much had no idea at all. Which means that the only thing we know for certain is the 5 days until they were originally scheduled to arrive. Seth summed it all up. In that case, I don't have the time for these tea parties. I will leave the management and rearrangement to you. I will be at the workshop, the blacksmith added and stood up. Seth was of the opinion that he had something more important to do. The last 2 encounters had raised a concern in his mind. Apart from the immortal, both incidences had demons that were close to attaining the legendary status as demons. Blacksmith himself was just a legendary demon, but he had several demons comparable to Alzalsar in level when she was a lich under him. Then what about Spacia? They were undoubtedly a greater force than Blacksmith as they had an undetermined number of legends under them. Of course, there weren't tens of them, but that wasn't the point. Just how many near-legendary people would they have? Even when they didn't send their full forces to Earth, what if there were more than they anticipated? Maybe not many legends, but dozens of people in the late 100s were just as bad. He had spoken with Lena about his worries. As the princess of an empire comparable to Spacia, she was the best source of information. However, even she as a princess had no idea about the number of legends her own empire had, much less how many Spacia was actually hiding. It was similar for people in the late 100s. She only had slightly more than the common knowledge of the topic. Usually, the kingdoms across the pathworks, with enough power to make a name for themselves, had 2 to 3 legendary people. Normal factions within a world seldom even had one. The princess had assured him that Minas Mar was doing very well. With the addition of Alzalsar, there were now 4 confirmed legends in Minas March. Apart from her, there were many beings with the potential of becoming legends in the near future, as well as the inner members who were all decked out in legendary and relic-rated equipment. Still, their opponent was a terrifying necromancer. Nadina wouldn't have stayed idle either. Not after she got an undead dragon. Just how many undead would she have gathered in the meantime? It was a lot easier for her to kill and resurrect a strong beast than it was to make a golem. Even with the golem forge, necromancers fought in numbers and nothing stopped her from farming a high number of super powerful troops. Seth simply worried that they still didn't have enough firepower to ensure their victory. Everyone intended to prepare for a gruesome battle and hoped for a hard-fought victory, but not the blacksmith. Some may say he lacked emotional maturity, or maybe he was even naive, but Seth wasn't ready to accept the loss of people as an inevitable outcome of war. What he wanted was a certain, overwhelming victory. The enemy should bash their head in against their defenses and die before anyone even had the chance to get harmed. To get as close as possible to this ideal, he had 5 days. Just 5 guaranteed days. Would making Nems or Daolun's items help a lot? No. There wasn't any time for them either. Weapons and armor wouldn't help much. His thoughts wandered to his talk with Alzalsar a few days ago, after she suddenly appeared in the meeting. So my dream was true. You actually became a legend, the blacksmith said. The two were sitting together in a cozy room adjacent to the meeting room and drank a cup of hot beverages the sorceress had brought from her journey. Ding! You have consumed Mystic coffee. Your fatigue is alleviated. Endurance and agility have permanently risen by 2. The mysterious coffee she bought from the people of Mystic actually permanently raised his attributes, which had been stagnant for quite a while now. His agility had reached 325 points and his endurance 343. But why did you only come now? Seth asked her. They didn't have much time to talk about her story. When she arrived earlier, however, unlike the others, Seth knew that she had been a legend for a while. And that she slew a dragon. I didn't know legends could already enter this world, she admitted a little embarrassed. I stayed close to a port to Earth in a different world and waited for news to enter. So, how did you kill the dragon? Seth asked the juicy stuff. As they drank the coffee, Alzalsar told him the story of her advancement, which almost had him spit out the coffee again. He heard about the dragon Titus and her quest for revenge for the first time. Ultimately, the sorceress had managed to slay the beast that had interrupted her first ascension to become a legend and reach this goal through this very feat. Of course, he congratulated her from the depth of his heart, but there was a more pressing question on his mind. Did you dismantle the body? Since you asked me to meet you separately like this, is it because you have a gift for me? The blacksmith asked. Even if it was just a lower dragon, the materials from its body were legendary dragon stuff. How could he not look forward to it? At Seth's glistening eyes, Alzalsar actually hesitated for a moment before she continued speaking. Yes, I dismantled it. And yes, I brought most of its body with me. After that, she had shown him the materials she harvested from her archenemy's body. Tidus was a sky blue dragon, a subspecies specialized in magic. The damage negation couldn't compare to those of an ancient dragon, but they also had the effect of improving the power of magic and mana regeneration. All of them were top-class materials and would make for some of the best legendary armaments he made so far, but he still remembered the process of making his own armor. Dragon materials were equally as tough to work with as they were powerful. With the 5 days remaining, he wouldn't be able to finish many items. Maybe not even one. No, there was something else, one thing he was confident in. Something he kept pushing back because of the tournament, and 5 days may just be enough to do it. Chapter 1166 Greed Wood. Soul of Donchad, Epic, X, Ego, the soul of an Marvo, an undying being, forcefully detached from its undead body. Soul contains 85% of the Marvo's original knowledge and skills and 12% of its personality. Donchad, a creature that had appeared with the awakening of the realm. An undead beast that was actually native to Earth, with similarities to vampires and liches. The creature had been fighting an army of golems for days. It was the first X-sized soul he had harvested since Alzalsar. If he was honest, he had been hesitating because it was such a rare resource. He had been looking into its potential to make a weapon or armor, but ultimately, there was never a choice other than making it a golem. If the situation hadn't been dire, he may have kept hesitating and procrastinating on it, but now the decision was made. At least he had not been slacking off when procrastinating, the plans for a golem were already finished. The only thing left was to implement them. After taking his leave from the meeting, Seth returned to Mina's March. However, he did not directly return to his workshop. Instead, he paid a visit to the herb garden, or rather what was growing beyond the herb garden in Mina's March. The tree chamber was as breathtaking as ever, looking like a starry night with the magic lanterns in the crown of the massive tree in its center. Climbing the huge roots, it took him a few minutes to reach the thick trunk. "Karina? Are you there?" he asked, knocking against the trunk of the guardian tree. The second piece he needed for the golem was the wood of the hanging tree. In the blacksmith's opinion, the only material that could match the powers of Donchad was the wood of the guardian tree, especially its original traits as a hanging tree perfectly aligned with the nature of the Marvo's powers. The compatibility of Donchad's skills and the wood of the hanging tree was undeniable. The blacksmith still vividly remembered the devastation of the large-scale drain skills the undead had used to refill his mana, health, and stamina. "I'm always here, at least part of me," he heard, and a clone of the dryad stepped out of the trunk of the massive tree. "How can I help you this time? Do you need more core wood?" she asked playfully, knowing that this was probably the only reason Seth would visit the tree chamber. "You caught me there, sorry," he apologized, a little embarrassed, realizing that he really only came here when he wanted something. Nonetheless, he was here because he wanted something. Not core wood, but would it be possible to get wood with the original properties of the hanging tree? The dryad looked at him with surprise, before she pondered for a moment. "I could try condensing some of the original nature, but it won't be comparable to the core wood. Is that okay?" she asked innocently. The blacksmith couldn't help but think that the personality of these clones somewhat differed from the current dryad. Karina had changed a little ever since the hanging tree became legendary. However, these clones she was able to create were actually close to how the tree spirit acted in the beginning after Seth recreated her. "That will be fine," the blacksmith answered with a nod. As long as it fit the souls, the wood didn't need to be too sturdy. The wood was going to be the golem's flesh, while the blacksmith intended to make its frame from adamantium. Ever since Master Tord managed to create his own version of artificial adamantium, their supply was only limited by Seth's power of existence. Unfortunately, Tord's alloy was not as close to the final product as the ingots Seth had looted from the Theocracy of Chains back then. It took over 3,000 points of power of existence to refine one ingot of the faulty alloy into an ingot of genuine adamantium. He was barely able to afford it now. His point gain per day had risen quite a bit since the Pythian Games, especially after the award ceremony. This was why they now had a small supply of adamantium. After he gave his okay, the Dryad stepped back to the trunk of the massive tree and started deploying her magic in synchronicity with the tree. A little shiver ran down his spine when he recognized the energy that was collecting under her hands. It reminded him of the pressure when he witnessed the hanging tree that grew at the center of his home district. It was an experience he could never truly forget. Slowly, a thick branch, the size of a normal tree, started growing from the bark of the guardian tree. The aura surrounding this branch was dark and ferocious. It matched the feeling of the hanging tree to a T. His heart beat a little faster, not just because of the unhappy memory it brought back, but at the thought of creating a golem exuding this kind of aura, coupled with Don Chada's skills. He didn't even need to appraise it to know that it was exactly what he needed. Karina had easily fulfilled his request. After growing to the length of a person, the branch grew thin at the base until it broke off from its own weight. "There you go," the clone prompted him to take his material with a kind smile. The mesmerized blacksmith shook his head to get back to the present and appraised the trunk instinctively. Guardian tree's greed wood, crafting material. Relic. The culmination of the dark aspects of Earth's guardian tree. Incredibly hard wood filled with the unbending desire to devour and grow in a never-ending cycle. You can feel power draining from your hand with a simple touch. Trait, hanging tree's absorption. The hanging tree's absorption was the original power the tree used to extract nutrients from its victim, only leaving them as a dried-up husk hanging from its vines. It fused life, health, and stamina drain as well as blood absorption. Seth froze when he saw the stats. Was Karina always able to make this kind of wood? This sounded like an incredibly strong power for a weapon if the trait could be controlled, but it activated on touch. An item that drained resources from the user every time you touched it the wrong way was inconvenient, but at the same moment, Seth could also think of a way to minimize that inconvenience. Maybe he was going to make some stuff with the shavings, once he was done. "Thank you, Karina." "Well then, time is pressing, I hope you understand," the blacksmith said, hurried to store the trunk of greedwood in his inventory. "Of course. Are you going to use that wood for another golem?" she asked, curious as he was about to leave. "Yes, I hope to add another friend to our forces, before things start," he said with a smile, before he vanished, teleporting to his workshop. As its reputation implied, adamantium was a bitch to forge. The toughest, most resilient metal barely budged, despite being brought to heat and filled with to the brim with the power of energy circulation, 3, which had recently turned leave 2. It didn't help that the bard had gotten a little ambitious with the build. Not only was he singing the ballad of Elufsuf the Asuriant and paying the demon off with souls, but he was also running soul infusion leave 9 at full force to meld half of Don Chada's soul into the golem's adamantium skeleton. While Seth was busy with that, he left the cutting of the wood to Cerberus. There was no modern chainsaw that could easily chew up magical woods. But the workshop guard was almost as good with a manual saw that his speed equaled to a sawmill. The wood Cerberus was cutting would become the armor and flesh Seth would attach to the frame once it was done. While the golem was done filleting the trunk in a matter of a day, Seth took 3 days to manufacture the parts of the frame, despite hurrying as best as he could. If forging was a bitch, engraving adamantium was hell. Just engraving and assembling the parts of the frame took just as long as forging the whole thing. But now he was at least finished the foundation. He had worked for 3 days straight, only taking a break to eat or chuck a stamina potion to get through the fatigue. He was tired and drenched in sweat, but at no point did he entertain the idea of stopping. Radiant Forgerite's absolute focus and craftsman's precision had him in their grasp. The positive thing was that at least Don Chada's ego, or what was left of it, was not in a position to resist or sabotage him during the crafting. With just 12% of its original nature left, Seth intended to add one of the prepared Mad Ithilden cores with the Olympian automaton ego, to give the remaining ego a new nucleus to take root. He was just about to wipe his sweat away, when "Tower Master," someone suddenly asked from behind and started him. Chapter 1167 System Quest? "Tower Master," someone suddenly asked from behind. Seth jumped a little. He had just finished the part for the frame and put down his hammer. He had not noticed that someone had entered the workshop and watched him. "You are one of Mary's people, right? Want do you want?" The blacksmith didn't bother admonishing him. He wanted to take a short break anyway. "Ah, Lady Mary sent me to give a quick status update on the Delta and the Pythian village," he quickly answered. Seth was worried for a moment, signaling the man to quickly report. However, nothing was worrying about the report. With the help of Commander Garoun, Minasmar was able to quickly sort out and fortify their position in Delta. The Pythian village left to some of Mary's managers, had also calmed down tremendously. It was no wonder since most visitors had left. The games had ended, so there was no need to stay any longer on Earth. At first, Seth questioned why they even sent that report, but he quickly realized why. It was Mary's way to tell him not to worry and concentrate on his own work. Knowing that they were doing well, preparing for the coming dangers, put his mind at ease and allowed him to dive into the work. "All right, tell her that I got the report. Tell her I will be finished in time," he added the last part, after giving it a moment of thought. The day after tomorrow would be the day that Spacia was originally supposed to arrive through the system church. He wanted to finish his work before their guaranteed time ran out. Any more days they bought by delaying this arrival were a bonus. After the messenger left, Seth took an hour break to take a short nap, before he got back to work. The next step in the process was forging the flesh of the golem. After the trunk was cut into discs by Cerberus, Seth was able to see the wood's natural color for the first time. It had a distinctive red tinge, like mahogany, but the rings inside were dark brown, like dried blood. Feeling the wood under his hammer was bliss, after the torture that was forging the adamantium. It felt like he was shaping clay at this point. It was almost relaxing, despite doing even more than before. In addition to singing the forging ballad, and infusing the soul of Donchad, he was also using reinforcement in addition to energy manipulation, 3, to strengthen and harden the greed wood, as he shaped the cross-sections of the trunk into armor parts he would attach to the frame. As for the ballad, Seth did not use the essence devourer which he used on the adamantium. For the greed wood he decided on an old classic. The bard used one of the first demonic ballads he had learned, it was the blood drinker ballad Alzalsar taught him. It not only fit the characteristics of the wood but hoped it would allow the material to further strengthen itself in the future, as it would bathe in the blood of its opponents. Or something like that. Under the reinforcement of the skill and the influence of the demonic power saturating the wood, turned it darker. The red of the wood became a deep crimson with a purple tinge, like the color of wine. The pattern of the growth rings turned completely black. As he forged the armor plates, they turned to look like pattern-welded steel, dyed with red wine. One by one, wooden discs turned into a full, articulated plate armor, housing the soul of the Nem Marvo. And one by one, he attached them to the frame, slowly building a humanoid figure. Donchada's original appearance was close to that of a tall burly dwarf. Maybe it would have been better to design the golem in a similar proportion to allow the soul to get used to it quicker, however, Seth did not have the time to account for a burly physique. Leaving behind the pure aesthetic of a knight, Seth didn't build any substructure for the armor, instead, he built it directly to the skeletal frame, creating a sleek almost skin-tight looking, red armor with wine red and black markings. Seth had strayed from his usual design, but what he found off the beaten track intrigued him. The resulting vessel looked more like a robot with the looks of a knight. It was most definitely an armor, but it was too slender and elegant for a human to fit in. Maybe it was even more correct to call it a battle puppet. The last step before placing the breastplate, was setting the golem core into the mount he prepared in the adamantium frame. This was a core of Mad Ithildan, enchanted with the generic automaton core circuit of Hephaestus. He had used a similar core for Hoskin and prepared several of them in advance. He hoped this would allow the soul to generate an ego not just quicker, but also a more obedient one. Although Donchad had suffered from mind decay, the 12% that was left had the potential to be problematic. Carefully, Seth installed the core in the chest of the golem and connected it to a piece of the soul, before fixing the breastplate to the frame finishing the golem. On the evening of the fourth day, since he started the work, the blacksmith was finally about to finish his work. Once the core was installed, the battle puppet jerked for a moment, before the empty eyes of the mask helmet turned to Seth, as if it was waiting for instruction. This was the automaton ego taking control of the body. With a wave of his hand, Seth summoned the waters of Styx. The massive sphere of water was calmly floating before the two. "Step inside," he instructed the golem. With a nod and no hesitation, the new creation stepped into the water, to have the soul fused to the body and be reborn anew. Ding! You have created a relic-rated automaton. Right after he got the notification that the automaton was finished, he was able to give the golem a final name. He would have called it Donchad, but its new appearance had nothing in common with the ugly, undead dwarf sorcerer. Seth had a nicer sounding name, which still had a connection to its previous appearance and deeds. Your name is now Strix, he names the battle puppet. It stood silently for a moment, not answering, before it nodded and the name appeared in its status panel. Ding! Your power of existence has risen by 1000 points. Ding! Your skill enchantment, Master, Leave 2 had become enchantment, Master, Leave 3. Ding! New enchantments have been unlocked. The notification following the completion came and he was notified that his enchantment had finally leveled up again. The blacksmith had ground his production skill quite a bit in the weeks leading up to the Pythian Games, leading to his goldsmith reaching level 2 and blacksmith now being close to level 3. He was about to look into the enchantments when another notification popped up and stopped his train of thought. Ding! 4 of your creations have met the preliminary requirements to inherit a system myth. Ding! You have triggered a system quest. System quest, Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. Difficulty, S. 4 of your creations have met the basic requirements to earn the chance of inheriting the roles of the 4 mythical horsemen of the apocalypse and become a legendary set. Fulfill the advanced requirements to allow your creations to inherit the powers of the 4 horsemen and become legends. Requirements: fashion the horsemen their condign arms and steeds. Wolfram, Conquest. Bow of Conquest 1/1. Mount of Conquest 0/1. Bazalith, War. Sword of War 1/1. Mount of War 0/1. Strix, Famine. Scale of Famine 0/0. Mount of Famine 0/0. Hoskin, Death. Mount of Death 1/1. Reward: 1. The creations will inherit the power of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and become legendary. 2. Gain the unique title, Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. The power of all doomsday devices increases by 25%. Creations gain 15% to all attributes in a world, facing its perceived demise. Do you accept the system quest? Yes/no. Chapter 1168 Dark Picture. The 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse? They were actually a thing? The blacksmith was taken aback by the sudden quest. Seth had heard of the 4 horsemen during his travels after he left Earth, but he had always thought they were just some kind of allegory. Conquest and strife for power always caused war. Wars were a heavy burden on the nations in conflict, especially in less advanced worlds. This burden led to famine in the populace and ultimately, all of them led to the death of many people, either by the weapons of war or the consequences of famine. All system worlds started off facing their world ending. This course of events happened often, as such people talked of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse appearing in the throes of the world's end. Or so he thought. However, the quest suggested that they were real, myth-ranked beings. If that was true, they must have ridden at least once, to end a world. As for the quest, was there any reason to hesitate? Even though he didn't know about the 4 horsemen on Earth, they were a big thing in the system worlds. Promoting Wolfram, Hoskin, Bazalith, and Strix directly to legend and inheriting their powers, and all he had to do was arm them properly. Of course, he accepted. Now Seth had a little shopping list of things he had to accomplish in the near future. The question was whether would be able to make some of these before Spacia came, and they were sure they would come. 4 of their 5-day grace period had been used to create Strix. He didn't have time to test its power, but judging by stats, Strix was around the level of Bazalith. Seth only hoped that the skills of Donchad would allow it to have a huge impact in battle. Right now, it was early in the morning of the 5th day. With probably the greatest quest he had ever gotten before his face, he deliberated changing their plans. If he could succeed in the quest before Spacia arrived. He wobbled for a moment. First, he needed to get some sleep, then he would have to talk with the others about the 4 horsemen. He just left the workshop when his communication orb vibrated. Seth, we have news. Lena's voice echoed in the room, the moment he answered the call. Cinema Dimension. The cinema had fallen silent at the revelation of the quest. All eyes were either openly staring or secretly glancing at the god in the robe with the playful star pattern. The hood looked up at them, its mood undiscernible to the onlooker. What? He asked, turning to Hades and Seth, 2 gods that dared to stare directly at him. Isn't that a little excessive? I mean, the 4 horsemen, Hades mumbled and shrugged his shoulder. Even high-ranking gods had respect for powerful myths. When the 4 horsemen rode, not even the gods could stop them. Even if the blacksmith's golems would pale in the face of the real thing, it was well and truly an apocalyptic set. You worry too much, Hades, Seth said, waving his hand. aren't you looking forward to what will happen from here on? If he managed to fulfill the quest, I can't wait for their clash with Spacia. Even if it's just that little necromancer girl of Kali and her underlings. While the gaze of Hades showed a slight worry about the decision, the look the god of chaos and destruction gave the system god was different. The desert god's eyes were actually twinkling with admiration. Right, I knew Seth would understand it. Isn't it fun? And it's not like I tweaked the requirements to make it possible, he earned it all on his own, the system god said smugly, having found an ally. He was serious. It had actually taken the blacksmith longer than he expected to get the quest. He waited with bated breath for the little blacksmith to fulfill the requirements ever since he finished Basilith. Since then, he had created many golems, but none who could have fit the role of hunger. The timing was great. That is if he gets to finish the set before the chosen of Kali arrives, Apollo commented with caution. This was exactly why it was so interesting. How could they not understand? Isn't there anyone watching her champion here? Hermes asked loudly in the room. Nobody said anything until the dungeon god cleared his throat. Kali has banned anyone from watching her and this stream simultaneously, he said a little embarrassed, admitting that he tried to send an avatar to watch at her place. As a man in the business himself, he was a sucker for seeing a situation from multiple perspectives. PSHT, someone suddenly interrupted the conversation. What? Who shushed at me? Who dares? The dungeon god got a little upset. Shut up, don't you see that we are about to get an answer to our question? Hephaestus, who had kept his attention on the screen, barked at him. Slightly earlier, Minas Mar. Seth was about to ask Lena what was going on when the door of the workshop was shaken by the quick staccato of heavy knocks. Someone was slamming their fist at the door as if they tried to break it down. Who would dare to be so brazen in the smithies at this time? Tower Master, it's me, Bart. I got urgent news, the chosen of Crius shouted from outside. His breathing was heavy from running there and trying to punch the door out of the frame. What did my door do to you? The blacksmith shouted, charging out of the workshop. Can't you just call me like normal people? He came down on the mountain of a man with the easy-to-provoke anger of a man who had not slept for almost 4 days, waving around the communication orb in front of his face, that still had Lena connected to it. Bart? What are you doing there? The princess exclaimed, her voice being transmitted by the orb. Seth, can you please stop shaking the orb around? I'm getting nauseous, Mary asked pitifully from somewhere in the back. It seemed that he wasn't just talking with Lena. Awkwardly, Seth stopped shaking the orb in the other man's face. Sorry, Mary. I'm here because I have news from Y City. Undead have appeared close to the center. Bart explained his presence. Although Bart had become the chosen of Crius and had come to Little Gamma to join Minas Mar, many of his men were still in Y City, patrolling the streets and reporting anomalies to him. Undead, the question came from the orb, concern in Lena's voice. Undead meant there was a dark magic user or necromancer involved. The chances this was Urgit Noer were low. What were they doing? She added worriedly. They have taken over what was left of the system church and are guarding the premise, the chosen of Crius explained further. The system church in Y City had ceased operation. After the Great Battle the city had fallen, most refugees migrated to Minas March. Since Samuel became the system god's saint he also left Earth, while the staff was redistributed to branches in Minas March. Suppressed curses came from the orb in his hands. The answer from the orb was a row of curses, exclaimed by the princess. Lena, do you want to add something to the conversation, apart from your potty mouth? Seth asked her with a slight tease. Dylan Mo contacted me. He had been monitoring the situation in Gamma and Sigma in case of changes. However, he just contacted me that there were signs of teleport activity in Gamma, she said gravely. The mood to tease her instantly vanished. Either of the news was concerning, but putting what they just heard together, painted a dark picture. The grace period was over. Chapter 1169 No Method Too Malicious. During the Pythian Games, Gamma, which had fallen into the hands of Argit Noer, had suddenly fallen to an invincible wave of undead shadow warriors. Although they didn't help the undead empire, they kept a close eye on the situation. Adding Bart's information, it makes sense now. They probably had people overlooking the system church ever since the Y City was abandoned. I bet they used it as an entry point to Earth and intended to come to Delta from there. When that didn't work, because we closed the teleport hub, they must have turned to Gamma. We always guessed that Spacia was behind what happened to Argit Noer, but this is technically a guarantee it's the truth. Lena spoke quickly, excited, but also shaken. Her theory suggested that not only did Spacia have a fixed entryway to Earth, but they also had a path to forward their troops directly to Gamma. Although Gamma was not much closer to Delta, compared to other districts, it had the land of dead. Their opponent was a powerful necromancer and now they had a base that constantly nurtured undead. It also meant that they probably didn't have that much more time left. It would take high-level players up to a week to traverse the mountains on the ground, but Nadina could just pack her army on the dragon and fly over here. The enemy had the potential to arrive within less than 2 days from now. Doesn't seem like we have much time, Seth concluded disgruntled. If things were like this, he wouldn't be able to finish the quest before Nadina arrived. I think we have to change our plans a little, Seth announced. His quest, the new information, and the shortened time called for it. It was reassuring that most of their preparations were already done. Lena had kept him updated about their progress while he was crafting. They had dealt with the aftermath of the demon attack in Delta. As the Central District was apparently Spacia's main goal, there had been a lot to fix to get ready, after Krana technically sabotaged the city to fail the moment they left. Yet, Delta was most likely the most fit to face a siege of the current cities in Earth. With Project Ego in place, its defense was assured. Seth had full confidence in Alzalsa's work, even if they were to face Nadina's mountain-sized dragon. A big part of the preparations was not in Delta, although they were the most urgent here. Spacia was a superpower and it would have been naive to expect that they would focus all they had in one place. Even the scene had attacked several tree stations at once. It was up to Lena and the others to manage their human resource to assure the safety of all tree stations, in case the Empire decided to besiege them simultaneously. Even if that meant that they stretched their power a little thin. Business in Little Gamma had also finished. Lena and Mary had not just taken care of the consequences of battle in the Pythian village but had also managed everything necessary to station the fleet of Epsilon in TS5, as their new home. One of the measures to ensure safety across Minas Mar, the district. TS4 and 5 were not big yet and were only protected by smaller forces, without any announced guardian, while 6 had Angelique, the Mirror of Dawn, who was slowly gaining levels as Seth's servant revived by the Permit of Hades. With the fleet stationed at 5, they would be able to help either of their neighbors quickly, if there was a need for it. Delta would be mostly protected by his creations, especially the big guns. He had no intention to hold back this time. While most of the golems were stationed in Delta, they would send members of the field teams, Oathguard, and some golems to all tree stations that lacked high-grade troops. This was a measure to guard against Spacia changing targets, but also to put more precious personnel in safer places. Many of the golems and the Faer could regenerate if they were destroyed, but the dead were a little harder to revive. While Delta and the tree stations are ready, we still need to buy some more time, Seth opened up to his friends. The blacksmith revealed the quest he had just received. Some listened with attention but lacked understanding. Others who came from or traveled in the system worlds had shock written on their faces. Becoming a legend by inheriting from a myth was one of the hardest but also one of the strongest known methods. Dragons were the best example of it. All dragons were legends because they inherited power from the myth of dragons. Now, Seth talked about his 4 golems becoming legendary horsemen of the apocalypse. They had decided to teach Spacia a lesson, and what better lesson was there than steamrolling them with the horsemen of the apocalypse? But for that, he needed time to finish them. Seth needed to provide his 4 creations with 3 steeds and a weapon to complete the quest. Just 2 or 3 days wouldn't be enough. After all, the quest spoke of condign arms and steeds. Seth couldn't just throw something crude together and call it a day. The golem steeds he mass-produced wouldn't do it, and producing 1, much less 3 by hand, he doubted there was enough time for that. They needed to buy more time for him. Originally, buying time may not have been feasible, as they didn't know the plans of Spacia, but now? While there was a chance that Spacia changed their strategy after finding the system church in Delta blocked, they doubted it. The time was just too short. Even if there were other factors, like spies or missed reports from imprisoned spies, it was unlikely that the enemy would change the course of its main forces at this point and focus on one of the tree stations. They wanted Delta. Nadina wanted Seth. She wanted revenge on Minas Mar and maybe even Earth in general. It was the only explanation for why she would come personally. Although the tree stations had developed a lot in the past few months, Delta was still the biggest and strongest known target on Earth. Finding it destroyed by demons or occupied by rebels, it was their best public excuse to lay waste to Delta. Conquering, or getting completely rid of it was also the easiest and most cruel way to break them. If they started with the tree stations, they could still try to evacuate people to Delta, but if Delta was gone, things would be tighter. Without a doubt about their target, what stopped them from setting up traps? As they said, the best defense was a good offense. They quickly started brainstorming ways to hamper Spacia's advance. No method was judged too malicious, or cruel to make them suffer. Especially Daolun, their newcomer, shined in this discussion, offering her various skills. Guerrilla warfare was the name of the game, and especially the Faer that had rejoined after the battle with the demons were fire and flame for this game. The biggest trump card they had against Nadina might have been Hoskin. Like the Beasts of Calamity, the Death Knight was allowed to roam freely. He had traveled north of Delta and apparently assembled an army of the dead. Seth had not seen him since then, but they had called him back once they knew that Spacia was coming. Hoskin was also the only horseman who didn't need anything from him. The blacksmith was curious what his steed looked like, but it had to wait. With the Death Knight's power to naturally dominate, he was like the natural enemy of necromancers. Putting him in Nadina's way was the greatest trump card to buy time. After spending 2 hours talking and refining their plans, Seth left organizing everything for them. Time was precious, now more than ever. Sleep? How could he think of sleeping? He had to start working. Making a weapon for Strix was the first point on his agenda. Then he could completely concentrate on the steeds. And if Spacia managed to come before he finished, at least the golem would have a weapon to boost its powers. The armament of hunger was a scale. Seth was convinced that it was simply a symbol of the original myth. What exactly it symbolized in connection with famine, he had no idea. There was also no description of its power in any sources he found. Now, Seth was a blacksmith and not a scale maker, so he was poring through images of scales on the web to find inspiration. While the traditional imagery of famine asked for a balance, the bard just couldn't warm up to the idea. Luckily the quest only said a scale, without defining how exactly it was supposed to look. Maybe a great enchanter like Alzalsar would have approached this in a different direction and created a powerful mystical artifact. Well, what he realized was that he wasn't happy with the image of Strix the night puppet to carry a simple scale, like a priest would a cross. Although time was running out, the lack of sleep caught up to him as the situation turned quiet. Soon he rather listlessly scrolled through the search results, thinking up random ideas, like a sword that had the guard as the beam of a scale. But that would have been a sword and not a scale in the end. The search results became more and more obscure and unhelpful as his thoughts slowly wandered off when his eyes fell on something that had him doubt it was a scale in the first place. It looked outlandish and dangerous, and it spoke to Seth. He got excited. If a horseman of the apocalypse carried around a scale, it's this one, it whispered in his ears. Inspiration started bubbling up, as the blacksmith made the decision and got to work. He wanted to make sure that, by the time Spacia arrived, Strix would swing this around. Chapter 1170 in Gamma. A day later, Gamma. Seated on an ostentatious palanquin that also acted as a throne, her gaze drifted over the ruins of Gamma. She had to admit, judging by the ruins that were left, that this world used to have a great civilization. Technological advancements without any magic were fascinating. Not really desirable if you already have advanced magi tech, but interesting nonetheless. There were zones across the myriad worlds of the Pathworks that lacked magic, or had anti-magic zones. There were even places that blocked the usage of skills. It was rare to get a chance to see this kind of civilization, as they would usually completely cut off their connections to the Pathworks, once they got the hang of how to do it. She only had this chance because this world was abnormally riddled with terrifying catastrophes. It was almost a shame that she was going to crush everything that. Only almost. Things had changed a lot in the past 2 years for her. Ever since she was able to become the chosen of Kali in one of the new territories, her standing with the family had risen. During the evaluation of Krna, she managed to get her hands on undead with great potential and even managed to return to Spacia with a quasi-legendary skeleton dragon that could rival legends. With this kind of power, her Durnham family had even risen to the standing of royalty, just below the imperial family. Their land had expanded to the size of a kingdom. There was only one blemish on her rise to power. The humiliation she suffered at the hands of the bard. Although her deeds at the evaluation were an overall success, he had gotten in her way and thwarted her plans. His vulgar song and dance that mocked her and played with her emotions was the worst. She had never felt so helpless and ashamed. She couldn't sleep comfortably with her pride trampled like that. He had to pay. All of them had to pay. To make matters worse, they kept resisting. Like an infestation that just couldn't be stopped. Nothing they had done so far worked. On the contrary, they kept losing resources and personnel. However, this time, they had created the perfect pretext to come here personally. It cost a lot, but she would make sure to flatten them with her own hands. Have the troops gathered? She asked, looking up from the cityscape, dotted with the burning spires of Arjit Noor. The undead empire had no chance against the traitor they supported. The Book of Death, the holy relic of Anubis, was unbeatable in a land of death like they created here. As a necromancer herself, she could feel the dark energy of the land nurturing her, making the usage and growth of skills easier. Once they dealt with Delta and Myanmar, maybe she would really set up a residence here. Even when this world was full of dangers, she was pretty confident. What could there possibly be that could threaten her? Yes, Your Highness. Everyone has arrived now, the servant that approached answered respectfully. The reason she was sitting here idle, was because they waited for the troops from Spacia to pass through the teleportation gate. Now the district below her was filled with almost 20,000 high-level soldiers, it had taken almost a full day to transfer them all here. Originally, they would have gone directly to Delta, but the connection to the central district was lost. Most likely something had happened with the demons. Either WebNovel betrayed them and broke their loose alliance or, the more likely assumption, Myanmar has interfered. Either way, it forced them to gather at the closest teleport point they controlled, Gamma. Good, have them board the swarm, we will set off as soon as everyone is seated, she instructed. Nervously, the attendant looked to the sky above, covered in dark clouds. Circling above them, creating a tornado of doom, were rotten shadows in numbers so great he could hardly make out any individuals. Nadina's confidence was not just based on her skeleton dragon, which had risen to legendary status after she fully refined it with her improved skills. Thanks to the dragon, she was able to improve herself and her undead army by leaps and bounds. What calamities! She laughed at the notion. She was the Horde, and the Horde would spread across Earth. She would kill and absorb anything that dared to get in her way. She would make all of Myanmar and all of Earth her undead servants and force the bard to watch as she played with their lives. She couldn't help but silently chuckle at the thought of her revenge. As she got off her palanquin, the mountain-sized skeleton dragon that towered behind her, lifted its head attentively. The hollow eye sockets glowed with a purple hue and a tinge of intelligence. All around the city ruins, the undead beasts flying in the skies soared to the ground, to pick up their human cargo. Undead wyverns, giant bats, zombie eagles, several bone dragons, other huge birds, and flying beasts could be seen in her swarm, landing on the ground to pick up her army. She herself obviously climbed on the back of her dragon, where they built a small pavilion for her and her executive staff to stay and meet. His fingers wandered over the smooth, cold surface of the book's obsidian pages. They were pale but looked no different from living flesh. He enjoyed the sensation of touch, having finally regained his senses of when he was alive and not a lich. It was all thanks to this book. Yet, he looked out the window of his spire in melancholy. He watched the overwhelming undead army and spacious human troops ascend to the cloud, leaving to subjugate Delta. At this sight, he couldn't help but question his actions. Did he make the right decision? He had worked with them and doomed his world to exist under the rampant tyranny of a bratty little girl. Yet, he could regret it. The only reason he had the leeway to think like this, was because his yearnings had been satisfied. He had escaped the suppression of Arjit Noor and gained an almost living body thanks to the decisions he made. Maybe the lives of everyone else in the world were not necessarily a sacrifice he was willing to make. But he would probably not change anything if he got thrust into the same situation again. But that didn't mean that he could try to mitigate the damages of his actions. After the forces of Spacia left the ground, the falcon-headed warrior of Anubis suddenly rose all over the city and pursued them. Now that they were all in the air, they were vulnerable to fall damage. Even high-level players had little chance of surviving a fall at total velocity on concrete. He would drop them like flies and... That was a really stupid decision, kiddo. He heard a voice behind him, but when he turned around, the scene in front of his eyes already started tilting. With a thunk, his severed head fell to the ground. He was an undead lich, severing his head was not lethal to him. Looking up from the ground, he found an unkempt middle-aged man sitting on the small sideboard at the wall behind him. He was still holding the long, sleek sword that had just severed his head. He belonged to Spacia and was probably a legend. But even a legend couldn't kill him if they didn't have Save the arrogant little sneer, I already have your phylactery, he said emotionless and suddenly crushed a crystal in his hands. It was the phylactery he was forced to use under the supervision of Arjit Noer's elders. With a loud cinematic screech, the head and body turned to dust before the legendary man's eyes. The many unceremoniously stepped to the pile of ashes and looked through it for the Book of the Dead, however, it was not there. The Lich also didn't drop an item box. And the army of Anubis also stopped their attack on Nadina's swarm. With a displeased grumble, he realized that they may have underestimated their collaborator. Somewhere else in Gamma,